I was standing inside the operations tent when the laughter died, not the loud kind. The sharp kind that stops halfway through a breath, like someone suddenly realizing they have gone too far. The map table in front of us was cluttered with grease pencil lines and folded overlays that never quite lined up. Radios crackled low, then, one by one, went quiet. I felt the shift before I saw it. Every head slowly turned toward me, waiting to see if I would say something or break. A few minutes earlier, they had mocked me, not openly. Nothing anyone could call out, just side comments. Smirks, that familiar doubt in their tone that said they did not believe I belonged in that moment. I kept my face neutral. I always did. Arguments only made things worse in places like this. Instead, I reached for the radio handset. My thumb hovered there longer than it should have, long enough for the room to tighten, long enough for the air to feel heavy. When I finally spoke, my voice stayed level. No anger, no explanation. I gave one order: clear, controlled, unavoidable. The tent stayed silent after that, not because they were impressed, because they understood. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I was a staff sergeant then, assigned as the operations non-commissioned officer for a mixed unit that rotated through a training and operations base tucked into farmland outside a small town most people had never heard of. The year was 2013. The place did not look important from the outside. A few long gravel roads, low buildings baked by sun and dust, and a perimeter that blended into open fields. But what happened there mattered. Everything we trained for passed through that base at some point. My job was coordination, routes, timelines, radial plans, making sure squads moved when they were supposed to and stopped when they needed to. It was not a role that got attention when things went right, and it got blamed fast when things went wrong. I had earned that position slowly, no dramatic moments, no favors. Just showing up early, knowing the maps better than anyone else, and staying late to check details nobody wanted to deal with. I was not popular, I was reliable. In the Army, that difference matters more than people like to admit. The unit was a mix of infantry, support, and attached specialists cycling through before deployment. Different personalities, different standards. Everyone carried their own version of pressure. Some were eager to prove themselves. Others were counting days until rotation ended. The daily rhythm was predictable on the surface. Morning briefings, movement drills, maintenance, night planning. But under that routine was constant tension. We were preparing for operations that did not allow mistakes, and everyone knew it. I felt skepticism often, but it was quiet, rarely direct. A raised eyebrow when I spoke. A pause before someone followed my recommendation. The kind of doubt that never shows up on paper but never fully disappears either. I learned to live with it. I learned that arguing only made people defensive, so I stayed calm. I stayed precise. Over time, most learned to trust the work, even if they did not fully trust me. The day in the operations tent came during a compressed training cycle tied to a larger movement operation. Multiple elements had to move through overlapping terrain on tight schedules. Weather was shifting. Communications windows were narrow. If one element moved late, another would cross paths where they should not. Timing was not just about efficiency. It was about safety. We were there to finalize the movement order. Routes were being adjusted in real time. Intelligence updates were incomplete. Everyone felt the pressure to push forward instead of slowing down. That is when mistakes usually happen. I had been tracking the timeline closely and noticed a gap that did not sit right. A window where two units would be blind to each other longer than acceptable. I flagged it quietly at first, not as a challenge, just a concern. That was when the comments started. Light, almost joking. Someone said I was being overly cautious. Another joked that I was seeing problems where there were none. Nothing loud enough to shut down, but enough to be heard, enough to remind me that doubt still lived there. I stayed silent. I watched the clock. I watched the maps. Coordination mattered that day because there was no margin. Radios would go silent at certain points. Visibility would drop. Once movement started, there would be no easy way to fix overlap or delay. Everything had to line up before the first step was taken. I knew that. I also knew that if I pushed back too hard, it would turn into an argument instead of a solution. So I waited. I kept listening. I let the room talk itself into confidence while I measured risk. When the laughter came, it was not cruel. It was casual. That made it worse. Casual doubt can get people hurt. The order I gave later did not come from pride. It came from responsibility, from knowing that consistency is not just about doing the job every day. It is about speaking when silence would be easier, even when you know you will be questioned for it. The first thing that felt wrong was how thin the intelligence summary looked once it was laid out on the table. Not wrong on paper, just incomplete. Too clean. The kind of report that answers the obvious questions and leaves the dangerous ones untouched. Recent activity was marked as minimal, no confirmed threats. No unusual movement. I had seen that language before. It usually meant nobody had stayed long enough to be sure. Outside the tent, the weather was shifting faster than predicted. Low clouds were pushing in from the west, flattening the light and pulling color out of the landscape. The fields around the base looked calm, but calm out there could turn deceptive fast. Dust hung low, and when the wind picked up, it carried sound in odd ways. Radios would work one minute and drop the next. Everyone in the tent knew that, even if they did not want to slow down to account for it. Terrain overlays showed narrow routes threading between shallow hills and tree lines that looked harmless until you stood in them. Lines of sight vanished quickly. A vehicle could disappear from view in seconds. The routes were workable, but only if timing stayed tight. Only if communication stayed clean. Only if assumptions held. Civilian movement was another variable nobody wanted to dwell on. The nearby communities were small, spread out, and used to military traffic passing through. That familiarity made things easier most days. It also made patterns harder to read. People moved when they always moved. Tractors, pickup trucks, foot traffic along fence lines. Nothing threatening on its own. Everything distracting if it crossed at the wrong moment. As the discussion continued, I watched how people leaned in when certain officers spoke and how they leaned back when I did. It was subtle, a shift of weight. Arms folding, someone checking a watch. Nobody cut me off. Nobody challenged me outright. That was the test. See if I would keep speaking anyway. See if I would overplay my concern and give them a reason to dismiss it. When I pointed out the overlap window again, this time with specific times and distances spelled out, the room went quiet for a beat too long. Then someone nodded slowly and said it was probably fine. Probably. Another voice added that we had run tighter timelines before. A third joked that weather always looks worse on paper. A few chuckles followed, light, easy, the kind that signals confidence, not cruelty. I felt the pressure settle between my shoulders. Not fear. Responsibility. The kind that comes when you realize you are the only one in the room who will carry the weight if this goes wrong. Command responsibility does not always come with rank. Sometimes it comes with awareness, and that can be heavier. Radio traffic filtered in from outside. Short updates. Vehicle checks. A pause here and there where someone keyed up and then went silent, like they were reconsidering what they were about to say. Those pauses mattered. They always did. People hesitate when something does not feel right, even if they cannot name it. I noticed a junior squad leader watching me instead of the map. He looked away when our eyes met. That told me enough. Doubt was spreading sideways, not upward. That is where it usually lives first. People waiting to see who will speak with authority and who will hesitate. No one told me to stop talking. No one backed me fully either. That middle space is dangerous. It invites compromise where clarity is needed. I slowed my own speech, chose words carefully, and let silence do some of the work. Silence can be uncomfortable. It can also force people to think. The wind pushed harder against the tent walls, rattling the frame. Someone adjusted a headset and frowned when the audio crackled. Another small sign, nothing dramatic. Just accumulation. Pressure building without release. I knew then that I was being measured. Not just on whether my assessment was right, but on whether I would stand by it when it was inconvenient. Whether I would retreat into agreement to keep the room comfortable. Whether I would let timing slip because challenging momentum is harder than going along with it. I stayed still. I listened. I waited. The moment had not arrived yet. But it was getting closer. The clock on the wall ticked closer to the movement window, and the tone in the tent shifted with it. What had started as calm discussion began to harden into opinions, not loud arguments. Just firmer voices, shorter sentences. People stopped asking questions and started stating conclusions. That was always a sign that time was winning over caution. One of the senior leaders traced a finger along the main route and said we were overthinking it. He did not look at me when he said it. He did not have to. Another added that delays would stack up fast if we kept adjusting. Someone else pointed out that every change increased confusion downrange. None of them said my name. None of them challenged me directly, but every word leaned against my assessment. I stood there with my hands resting on the table, feeling the weight of the choice settling in my chest. Speed or safety. Push forward and trust that everything would line up, or slow it down, adjust timelines, and risk being the reason the entire operation ran late. Both options carried consequences. Only one of them would be remembered if it failed. The weather update came through again. Still acceptable. Still within limits. That word again. Acceptable. It did not account for what happens when radios cut out at the wrong moment, or when a vehicle hesitates because a civilian wanders too close to the route. It did not account for the human side of timing. Someone asked if we could tighten the overlap window instead of shifting it. Another suggested staggering movements by minutes instead of adjusting routes. On paper, it looked clean. In reality, it assumed perfect execution from units already stretched thin. I knew that. I also knew how hard it would be to explain without sounding like I was slowing things down for personal reasons. The air felt thicker. Sweat collected at the base of my neck even though the tent was cool. I could feel eyes moving between speakers, gauging who had the room. Authority in those moments is not about rank alone. It is about confidence, and confidence can be contagious even when it is misplaced. I thought about staying quiet, letting the decision go forward. If something went wrong, it would be shared responsibility. That thought came with its own shame. Leadership is not about protecting yourself from blame. It is about carrying it when you have to. Another indirect comment came, this time framed as concern for morale. Someone said constant changes made people lose trust in the plan. I understood that. I also knew that people lose trust faster when plans fail in real time. The dilemma pressed in from both sides. I replayed the timeline in my head again, minute by minute, where silence would fall, where visibility would drop, where two units would be blind to each other longer than anyone realized. I imagined being out there, hearing nothing on the radio, trusting that someone else was where they said they would be. Trust is fragile in moments like that. My hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table. I could feel my pulse in my fingers. Not panic, focus. The kind that sharpens when you know a decision is coming, whether you want it or not. I looked around the tent. Faces were set now. Most were ready to move on. Momentum had taken hold. If I spoke up again, it would not be a suggestion. It would be a challenge to the direction the room was heading. That would cost something. Maybe not immediately, but later. It always does. I thought about the soldiers who would move first, about the ones who trusted the plan without ever seeing the map, about how they would never know there had been a choice. Only an outcome. The clock kept ticking. I took a slow breath and asked myself the question I always came back to in moments like that. Which choice would I be able to live with afterward? The answer came faster than I expected. Silence would be easier now. Speaking would be harder now, but silence would stay with me longer. The room waited, the mission window narrowed, and I knew that whatever I did next would define the rest of the day. The moment I knew I could not wait any longer came quietly. No alarm, no raised voices. Just the feeling that the room had already decided to move on without resolving the problem that sat right in front of us. The clock was edging closer to the window, and people were starting to gather their notes like the plan was settled. That was when it hit me. Hesitation at that point would not just be agreement. It would be permission for risk I could already see. I ran through the timeline one more time in my head. The dead space in radio coverage, the narrowing route, the stretch where visibility dropped and everything depended on timing being perfect. Perfect never happens. I had seen too many operations fall apart because someone assumed it would. If I stayed quiet, the plan would move forward exactly as written, and any mistake would unfold too fast to stop. My concern was no longer theoretical. It was unavoidable. I could feel it settle in my chest, heavy and steady. The mocking earlier no longer mattered. Neither did how this would look afterward. What mattered was the people who would step off believing the plan had accounted for everything. I glanced around the tent one last time. A few people avoided my eyes. A few watched me closely, like they sensed something was coming. No one spoke. That silence felt like a line drawn on the floor. I reached for the radio handset. My thumb paused there, resting on the push switch. Not because I was afraid. Because once I spoke, there would be no walking it back. The plan would change. The timeline would shift. Some people would be irritated. Others would be relieved. All of them would remember who spoke. I thought about why I had been given this role in the first place. Not because I was loud. Not because I demanded attention. Because I noticed things and spoke when it mattered. That was the standard I held myself to, even when it was uncomfortable. I pressed the switch. My voice came out steady. I did not rush it. I did not explain the entire problem. I did not justify myself. Experience had taught me that clarity matters more than persuasion in moments like that. I ordered the first element to hold their movement by a fixed amount of time. I rerouted the second element to avoid the overlap entirely. I adjusted the sequence so no one would move blind. The order was short, clean. Built from details I had already checked 3 times, no extra words. No room for interpretation. The radio clicked off. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the tent reacted all at once. Chairs shifted. Someone swore under their breath. Another leaned over the map and traced the new route, faster than before. A radio operator repeated the order back without being asked. Outside, I could hear engines powering down instead of revving up. The laughter from earlier did not return. It was replaced by a different kind of noise. Focus. Purpose. The kind that only shows up when a decision lands and people realize it makes sense, even if they do not like it. One of the leaders looked at me then, really looked. Not with surprise, with calculation. He nodded once, tight and controlled, and turned back to his radio. That was enough. Authority does not always need agreement. It needs compliance. The plan on the table shifted. Lines were erased and redrawn. Timelines adjusted. The mission window moved, but it did not break. People adapted faster than anyone had predicted. That was the part nobody acknowledged out loud. The system worked because someone had been willing to stop it for a moment. As the room settled into the new rhythm, I felt the weight of the decision fully land. Not relief, responsibility. If this went wrong now, it would be on me. That thought stayed with me as the first confirmations came back over the radio, clear and calm. The mocked concern was no longer a concern. It was the plan. And the base moved accordingly. The change rippled outward faster than I expected. Radios lit up almost immediately, overlapping voices stepping on each other as units acknowledged the update and tried to realign. Some of the confirmations came back clean and confident. Others hesitated, asked for repeats, or went silent for a few seconds too long. That silence always stretches. It never lasts long in real time, but it feels endless when you are responsible for it. Outside the tent, movement shifted direction. Vehicles that had been inching forward stopped and idled. Boots crunched on gravel as people redirected without fully understanding why yet. I could hear the difference in the sound of it. The smooth flow had broken, replaced by controlled friction. That is the sound of a plan adjusting under pressure. Inside, the room tightened again. Not with doubt this time, but with uncertainty. A few people adapted instantly, leaning into the new routes and recalculating without complaint. They trusted the order because it was clear. Others struggled. I could see it in their faces, in the way they stared at the map like it had betrayed them. Change costs energy, and not everyone has it at the same moment. Radio traffic surged. Call signs repeated. Time checks. Distance confirmations. A squad leader reported a delay clearing a turn. Another asked whether the stagger still applied if weather visibility dropped further. Each question landed on me now, whether it was directed my way or not. The decision had made me the center of gravity. I felt it settle in my chest, heavy and unmoving. I stayed still, listening more than I spoke. Every response had to be measured. Too fast, and it would sound careless. Too slow, and it would invite confusion. I answered what needed answering and let the rest resolve at the lowest level possible. Control does not mean touching everything. It means knowing when not to. One unit missed the first timing mark, not by much. A minute, maybe two, enough to raise concern. Someone glanced at me, waiting for reaction. I noted it, adjusted the next check, and moved on. Small deviations happen. Panic is what turns them into failures. The weather pushed in harder, just like I had feared. Wind pressed against the tent walls, and dust thickened the air outside. Visibility reports came in uneven. One element had clear sight. Another was already losing contrast along the route. The plan still held, but the margin was thinning. I thought briefly about the version of the day where I had stayed quiet, where none of this adjustment had happened. The thought did not bring comfort. It sharpened my focus. This was the path we were on now, and it needed attention, not regret. A radio crackled, then cleared. A calm voice reported that the rerouted element was moving clean. No civilian interference, pace steady. That helped. Another voice followed, confirming the hold had created enough separation to avoid the blind overlap, not victory. Just confirmation that the logic was sound. Still, nothing was guaranteed. Every update came with a mental calculation. If this slips, then that tightens. If weather drops further, we pause here. If comms fail, we fall back to timing. My mind stayed busy, not racing, just constantly measuring. I could feel the room watching me less now and working more. That was a good sign. Authority is fragile during transition. If people keep looking to you for reassurance, they are not doing their jobs. When they stop looking, it means they are moving. There was a moment when two calls came in at once, overlapping and garbled. For half a second, neither made sense. My heart rate ticked up, then one cleared, then the other. Both routine. No contact. No contact. No issue. I exhaled slowly and kept my face neutral. Responsibility deepened with every minute that passed. If the plan failed now, it would not be because of hesitation. It would be because reality had chosen differently. That is all you can ever ask for in these situations. A decision made with eyes open. As the flow stabilized, the noise settled into a steady rhythm. Radio still busy, but purposeful. Movement controlled, not rushed. The bass adjusting to a new truth without falling apart. I stood there, hands resting on the edge of the table, listening to the operation breathe. Not safe yet, not finished, but moving forward under control, and that was enough to keep going. The turning point came without drama, which is usually how the most important moments arrive. A calm voice broke through the radio traffic, steady but clipped, reporting unexpected movement along the original route. Not hostile, not confirmed, just wrong. A cluster of vehicles and foot traffic had drifted into the space that should have been empty, right where two elements would have crossed blind if the timeline had stayed the same. For a second, no one spoke. The room absorbed the words and replayed the map in their heads. I felt it land in my chest like a slow weight. That was the gap. That was the space I had been trying to explain without sounding alarmist. If we had pushed through on the original plan, someone would have driven straight into that congestion with no visibility and no margin to stop. The report continued. The rerouted element was clear. No contact. No confusion. They were already past the danger zone before the situation fully developed. The held element remained where it was, engines quiet, waiting. The separation we had created held. No one said "I told you so." No one needed to. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not awkward. It was heavy, the kind that settles when people realize how close they came to something they cannot undo. One of the senior leaders exhaled slowly and rubbed his face with both hands. Another leaned back against a table, eyes closed for a brief second longer than normal. A radio operator whispered a curse under her breath, not out of frustration, but relief. That sound carried more truth than any praise ever could. We listened as the situation outside resolved itself without incident. Local movement cleared. Routes reopened. What could have turned into panic stayed contained because no one was forced into it. The avoided disaster did not leave wreckage or casualties to point at. It left something quieter. Awareness. I stood there feeling the room recalibrate around me. No one laughed now, no sideways comments. No joking confidence. The respect that replaced it was not loud or celebratory. It was restrained, earned in a way that does not feel good at first. It feels sobering. Someone asked a follow-up question about next steps, and they looked directly at me when they did. That small shift mattered. Authority is not granted by acknowledgement alone. It is granted by trust when things go wrong, or almost do. The realization moved through the unit unevenly. Some people processed it immediately, others needed time. A few looked shaken, not because they had been wrong, but because they understood how close wrong can get before anyone notices. Those moments stay with you longer than success ever does. I felt no surge of pride, just a tightening in my stomach as the cost of the decision fully revealed itself. If the situation had unfolded differently, if timing or weather had shifted again, the outcome might have challenged the order instead of validating it. That uncertainty is part of leadership too. You never get certainty, only consequence. The mission continued under the adjusted plan, but the tone had changed. Voices on the radio were more deliberate. Confirmations came slower, clearer. People checked in instead of assuming. The system had learned something in real time. Later, when things finally eased, one of the leaders came up beside me. He did not congratulate me. He did not apologize either. He simply said, "We were lucky to have caught it in time." His voice was quiet. honest. That mattered more than any public recognition. Word spread the way it always does, not through formal channels, through glances, through changed posture, through the absence of doubt where it used to live. I noticed it in how people waited for my input without prompting, how questions came earlier instead of later. That moment reshaped how I was seen, but more importantly, it reshaped how I saw the role I carried. Being right is not the goal. Protecting people is. Sometimes that means standing alone in a room that wants to move faster than it should. The silence that followed the near miss stayed with me long after the radios quieted. It was heavier than laughter, heavier than praise. It was the sound of understanding settling in. And once you hear that, you never forget it. After the movement finished and the last confirmations came in, the base did not erupt into celebration. It never does. Things simply slowed down. Radios went quiet, one channel at a time. Engines shut off. People sat where they stood, helmets resting on knees, staring at nothing for a few minutes longer than necessary. That is usually how you know something important almost happened. I felt the exhaustion settle in once the pressure lifted, not physical tiredness. Something deeper, the kind that drains you after holding a line you were not sure would hold. I leaned against the edge of the table and let my hands go slack. For the first time that day, my pulse felt normal. Quiet conversations started around the tent, low voices, short sentences. No one replayed the near miss out loud. That comes later, if it comes at all. Right then, people were processing it privately. A squad leader sat on a crate and rubbed his eyes with both hands. A radio operator took her headset off and set it down carefully, like it weighed more than it should have. Relief was there, but it was complicated. Relief always is. It came tangled with the realization that the outcome could have gone another way, that if timing had shifted by minutes, or if weather had rolled in faster, we might be talking about damage control instead of reflection. Knowing you avoided something does not erase how close it was. I caught fragments of conversation as I moved through the space. Someone saying they had not liked the timeline from the start. Someone else admitting they had assumed it would work out because it usually does. No one framed it as blame. It was more like confession. People making sense of their own assumptions. A few came up to me quietly, not to thank me, to ask questions. About what I had seen, about how I weighed risk when there was no clear answer. Those conversations mattered more than praise ever could. They meant the moment had changed something deeper than opinion. It had changed how people thought. Later, when the tent emptied and the day moved on, the weight of it stayed with me. Leadership is often described as confidence, but days like that teach you it is closer to endurance. Endurance of doubt. Endurance of being measured constantly. Endurance of carrying responsibility without knowing if you will ever be acknowledged for it. Being right did not feel good. It felt heavy. I thought about how easily the room could have gone the other way, how close I had come to staying silent. That thought unsettled me more than anything else. Silence would have been easier. It would have cost less in the moment. It might have cost more later. Trust changed after that day, but not in a dramatic way. It showed up in small things. People checked in earlier during planning. Questions came with less edge. When I raised concerns in later operations, they were weighed instead of waved off. The skepticism did not disappear, but it softened. It became curiosity instead of resistance. Internally, something shifted too. I did not become louder or more forceful. If anything, I became more deliberate. I learned that confidence does not have to announce itself. It can be quiet and still hold ground. I also learned that being doubted does not always mean you are wrong. Sometimes it means you are ahead of the moment. The cost of that day showed up later in ways I did not expect. Sleep came harder for a while. My mind replayed timelines and alternate outcomes when the lights were off. Responsibility lingers longer than adrenaline. It asks questions when things are quiet. I thought often about the people who would never know how close things came. The soldiers who trusted the plan and moved when they were told. That trust is sacred. It deserves protection, even when protecting it means being unpopular for a few minutes in a tent. The memory of the mocking laughter faded quickly. The memory of the silence afterward did not. That silence carried weight. It reminded me that respect earned under pressure is different from respect given freely. One lasts longer. Long after the operation, when new faces rotated in and old ones moved on, that day still shaped how I moved through planning rooms. I listened carefully. I spoke when it mattered, and I remembered that leadership is not about winning arguments. It is about carrying doubt so others do not have to. Some moments stay with you, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. That was one of them. What stayed with me from that day was not the silence that followed the order or the way the room changed afterward. It was the weight that came with being heard. Once people listen, the responsibility does not ease. It grows. Every decision after that carries the memory of what could happen if you hesitate or choose wrong. Leadership is often described as authority, but it feels more like isolation when you are living it, especially for women. You learn early that demanding recognition only makes the work harder, so you let the work speak. You stay steady. You accept that proving competence is not a one-time event. It is something you do again and again in small rooms, under quiet pressure. I did not walk away from that day feeling victorious. There was no moment of pride or satisfaction. What I felt was resolve. A clearer understanding of what the role asked of me, to notice what others miss, to speak when silence would be easier, to carry doubt so others can move forward without it. I still remember the maps on the table, the low hum of radios, the moment my thumb pressed the switch, not as a highlight, as a reminder that leadership does not announce itself. It shows up when it is needed and disappears when it is not. Some stories stay with you because of what happened. Others stay because of what almost did. That day taught me that being heard is not the reward. Protecting people is. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.